This is the Miller philosopher. Honor, I think, often gets a bad rap. I mean, yes, everyone acknowledges its importance through the character of Aragorn, but that to me, it seems more like a retroactive respect rather than an actual respect. You mention the name Arnor, and you come up with a feeling like, yeah, too bad what happened to those guys, and just generally tend to feel sorry for them. Like they ought to be pitied because they are essentially losers. Yes, I said it. People look at Arnor as a bunch of losers, not just because they lose the Angmar Wars long before the Lord of the Rings actually starts, but because they couldn't even hold their kingdom together to begin with before those wars even started. And yes, I've heard people talk about the Grey Company as a bunch of badasses, like they're the special forces of Middle Earth. And I can see that for sure. But again, it's a retroactive cool rather than a proactive cool, I would say. Now, if I mention the name Gondor, then power, legacy, prestige comes to mind. Yeah, they're in decline, but they're still around by the time we get to the War of the Ring at least. And if you watch any of my earlier videos, then you know it's not like I give the Southern Kingdom a get out of jail free pass either. I'm not going to go into the details of that again, but if you're curious, feel free to check out the About list and the video list on the channel profile page, or just click on the cards that show up. All that said, however, this does make me wonder how they and their descendants of the Ranger community actually saw themselves. We get an idea of how others perceive them, either as dangerous and cautionary people who hang out in old ruins of their ancestors up north, or a rundown, ragged band of near savages whose lineages is more or less forgotten, or at least no longer worthy of mentioning with the same respect and entitlement to their name like their southern kindred. No cities to their name, and no real defined territory to speak of anymore. I mean, if they were the Dwarves, they would have lost it due to the amount of disrespect that they get. So, after doing some research, I put together a worldview based on their history, as well as comments about the Great Company from Return of the King. This isn't necessarily gospel, but more or less a profile of how these people might have seen themselves given those factors. Now, since both the Dunedain of the North and the South come from the same place, there are definitely similarities in their points of view. Both regions highly regard and revere the legacy of Numenor, though given their latter history, it escapes me how they couldn't be a bit more cynical about it either, like in the movie where Aragorn is highly skeptical of the failure of his people. And yes, I know people have a problem with that, but there it is. Both peoples also carried a sense of otherness to themselves and their bearing that most other Middle-earth communities often lacked. That mainly being inherited nobility of legacy, great strength, of course long life, and so on. Elements often communicated non-verbally, but just as powerfully when they speak. So much so that you almost get the impression that people looked on them as either elf lords or some other superior species other than human. Yet, for all their long life and nobility and etc., they were still just as fallible and just as human. And Arnor is the first to display this as the kingdom splits into three separate smaller kingdoms early on in the Third Age: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar. And they spend much of the centuries afterwards in civil wars or disputes over the lands of the North. Not exactly the noble bearing that the Great Company is later known for. And yet, despite this failing, they still seem to hold that they were a proud people, distinct from other races, until Rudar's line of kings and peoples is lost to internal strife and or intermarriage with other races, and that's a whole loaded issue I'm not even going to touch right now, but that this confidence still lasts throughout the Angmar Wars, yet I think also is slowly in decline as they get worse. And I say this because after the end of the Second Age, Gondor and Arnor / the North have no contact with each other afterwards, save that they both know that the other exists. Like they're the distant relative that you know lives in another country, but haven't seen them in years and don't know them anymore really. Compared to Gondor, the North was steadily in decline, and it seems like its kings were aware of that, and that would take an equal toll on the confidence as well. But the biggest indicator of the fact is when the two finally reestablish contact, that is, Arthedain is the first who initiates the claim to both realms, that of the North and of Gondor. Gondor couldn't even be bothered, despite their own wars with the Easterlings and the Harad. As I said before, prior, both peoples were proud of their distinction as separate territories, as well as Numenorian ancestry. But now Arthedain was ready to forgo that distinction. This implies a sense of encroaching desperation that Gondor isn't experiencing. Their people are dying and repopulating slowly, and the land is steadily being lost and or ruined to the wars. The Dunedain of the Rudar area, by this time, already became extinct. Meanwhile, Gondor has been building empires and alliances, and more importantly, didn't descend into civil war fracturing either. The closest they came was the Kinstrife, but they did survive that. Moreover, it specifically stated that the Council of Gondor's nobles already didn't think that highly of Arthedain to begin with, and this shows how much their status in the eyes of others was in trouble. Even the movies do a good job of communicating this disrespect when Boromir and his father Denethor speak of the North and of the Rangers, though in Boromir's case, it's only when he at first speaks of them rather than later on. Both barely acknowledge the fact that they are relatives and related and come from a lineage of great history, as well as still holding onto the line of kings. And as far as they're concerned, Gondor is doing fine on its own, even though it wasn't. Now, of course, we all know how this goes. Gondor decides to put their own king on the throne, but due to that king being an actually good and honorable guy, honors the request to help Arthedain, only to arrive too late before Angmar destroys the kingdom and the people go into hiding. Old news, been there, done that. And what this does to the Northern Dunedain, I believe, is deliver a serious piece of humble pie. That is, you could argue that Gondor and Arnor, when they first separated, could be interpreted as actually rival kingdoms rather than related ones, and that the only reason they didn't actually go to war with each other was the knowledge that they both had a shared history that was still prominent in both of their minds as far as communities go. It will look bad, after all, that the descendants of Numenor started killing each other, which in Gondor's case happened anyway, but that's another story. As the Third Age wears on, they find their fortunes being the exact opposite of Gondor, with an almost unending state of instability only further exacerbated by the Witch King. By the time of the fall of the North and the following final defeat of Angmar as a result of that, the North had to learn to survive without the pomp and splendor that they, Gondor, and their ancestors had been accustomed to. Hence why you see the Rangers of the North as kind of haggard and almost kind of beleaguered, yet still having some elements of nobility and strength with them. I imagine the Dunedain took the secrecy because although the Witch King was gone, it didn't mean he couldn't come back to finish the job like he had been doing for centuries, or that there weren't other threats that could easily, by their mysterious proxy, achieve the same end and make all the Dunedain and their line of kings extinct, period. Obviously, these extreme circumstances are going to create an extreme change in their worldview and philosophy, and this shows by the time of the War of the Ring, especially when compared to Gondor, Rohan, and its allies. The Dunedain of the North are still very proud of their lineage and legacy, and much like the dwarves, it seems, are extremely protective of their efforts whenever someone tries to make it sound trivial or that they're not as big or famous as their Gondor cousins. If Aragorn's comments during the Council of Elrond are anything to go by, then perhaps there may be even some level of envy or jealousy there, saying how while Gondor came to be respected and thanked for their efforts defending the south and the east, the Rangers went unappreciated and given little respect among the peoples that actually knew of their existence. And that's not even mentioning how Gondorians actually saw them either, if they even knew of their existence. Still, even if that was true, Aragorn and the Rangers didn't give into such petty thoughts. I think having been well aware that it was exactly such pettiness that led to the downfall of their people in the first place. Hence, why they seemed powerful, noble, almost supernatural, and yet at the same time humble and courteous. Pretty much unlike Gondor or anything associated with Gondor in almost all ways. Noble yet slow to speak. Long-lived and enduring yet roughed up, intimidating, and haggard in appearance. smelly, dirty, perhaps even uncivilized looking, and yet very civilized in how they carry themselves and in bearing, with the great strength and their combat abilities to match. The worldview, by the end of the War of the Ring, was a result of centuries worth of hard learned lessons that pride does indeed come before the fall, and that true nobility didn't come from lineage or from the throngs of crowds, but in carrying out their moral obligations to their fellow citizens of Middle Earth, no matter if they were from Numenor or not. Now, if you have any other insights you want to add to this, or perhaps feel that some information or that this perception is wrong, feel free to comment below. But otherwise, this is the Middle Earth Philosopher, and have a good day.